I literally got out of the car and a bunch of teenage girls spotted me and they came up and jumped on me and I was like, what the hell? I had all like lipstick marks all over my face and my girlfriend was in hysterics. That's
how it changed.
One viewing on Countdown and that's what happened. So instantly we were perceived as like pop stars or something, even though we were just these two young kids.
Sirens busy jiving, guess I'll make my move. Crazy feet on Ravilee, nothing.
What was the reason for you disbanding?
We never really disbanded, but what had happened is I think the music scene had changed so much and we could see that bands like this were irrelevant now.
Even back then?
Yeah, because the scene had changed. Like on a dime, it changed. Guns N' Roses and Nirvana happened, and then it was all Pearl Jam and Nirvana.
Yeah, but that was mid-90s though that they came around.
It was already starting to happen. Yeah, I think we could sense that. Like Prince couldn't even get any action.
Yeah, right. That's right.
At that point.
Yeah.
Because the winds of change were.
They were big.
Yeah.
I mean, Guns N' Roses, yeah, they were big around that time.
They were already happening. We did a TV show in the States with Guns N' Roses. This is hilarious, right? And they weren't really big yet. They were only just happening. Now, I was sitting outside the band room, just sitting there on my own, right? And then this dude comes up and starts talking to me. And he was Izzy from Guns N' Roses. So I was like, oh, g'day, man. How you going? Yeah, nice to, we talk about guitars and shit. And then this dude comes along with with leather pants and no top and a hat. And I'm thinking, who the fuck is this, right? And then he comes up and Izzy introduces me and goes, hey, Steve, this is Slash. And my immediate thought was, bad name, dude, you're going to have to change that because it means piss here. Like it didn't. Anyway, so I'm chatting away and then Paul Gray comes out and he goes, Steve, we're on, man, you got to come. So I said, oh, okay, cool, see you later, guys. And as we were walking off, Paul goes, man, you got to stop hanging out with those heavy metal losers. And I was like, nah, man, they're decent guys. Don't be so judgmental, right? And then about 6 months later, Guns N' Roses were the biggest band in the world. And I said to Paul, do you remember those heavy metal losers that you told me to stop hanging out with? And he's like, yeah. And I said, well, they're now the biggest band in the world. So maybe I should have hung out with them more.
Yeah. So how many albums did you record? Two. That was it? 2 albums? 2 albums
and 1 EP.
Yeah, right. Yeah. So the EP came first?
No, the first album came out. Then the second album, what happened is the first album came out in 86. The second album came out in 89. So it was way too long.
Yeah. Why was there such a long gap?
Because they kept... We serviced them with an album of like 20 tracks and they hated it because it was all weird and we'd gone all kind of Beatles-ish. And they were like, we need another Stimulation. I remember Paul Gray being in the studio and we were just mucking around. He had the synth and he was playing like the same rhythm but different notes on a synth of Stimulation. And he was singing this like... very rude sort of lyrics, this is what they want, man, which is sort of true.
So this is in Sydney you're doing a lot of this work?
The first album was recorded at 301, just Paul and I, over a 6-week period.
Yeah,
it was very efficient. Right now, the second album was recorded all over the place, including some stuff overseas and over a period of like 3 or 4 years. So it was very disjointed.
Was that an advancement that you had from CBS to do that?
Of course, that first album cost under 150 grand. And the second album cost just under $500,000.
Wow.
I know.
You would never hear those type of figures in this day and age.
We used to spend 100 grand on a video without batting an eyelid.
That's right. So where would you go overseas to record? Did you have any sort of idea?
We did some stuff in England. We had some stuff remixed in the States. We did stuff with, I think their studio was called PWL. It was Stock Aitken and Waterman.
Yeah, right. Kylie Minogue.
Yeah, and Bananarama and all that sort of stuff. So I remember we spent a fortune to have a couple of songs remixed by Stock Aitken and Waterman. And I remember Paul going, man, I reckon they've just used the percussion loop off the Mel and Kim song and they've just whacked it on top of Sugar Free and there's 50 grand or whatever.
Yeah.
Right? No, hang on, let me check. I've got that Mel and Kim record. You're right, man. You're right.
Yeah, it's crazy, right?
Insane. But the record company back then were of the view that if they weren't spending a shitload of cash, there was something wrong.
What about the rhythm side of things? Was it just purely drum machines? Or
it was all drum machine.
You never had a real drummer?
Not on the first record. The first record was all drum machine and sequence bass and keyboards. Paul would play all... It wasn't... I think this is the difference. Paul was a good enough player that nothing was quantized. Right? So he would play the bass line in... Whereas now it's all step programmed. You know, I mean, that's a huge difference, right? It's not that digital killed performance, it's quantization that killed performance. So everything became aligned to the grid.
Yeah.
That's what dehumanises music, yeah?
Yeah, that's right.
So the Wa Wa Nee records, even though they were, you know, played on the sequencer as such, the drums and the bass, Paul had played them. There were some live drums on that first album in that Chris Sweeney, our drummer, who was incredible, did some... Because the one weak thing with using drum machines was the cymbals.
Yeah.
So we'd get him to do live hi-hats and live crash cymbals. And I think there might be the occasional like bit of snare drum or something, but that was about it.
When you and Paul Gray first formed Wa Wa Nee, did you have a vision of the band's sound from the start, or did it evolve organically?
What happened was Paul had put an ad in the paper, yeah? And it said, synth player seeks guitarist. Now at that point, I'd been in rock bands for many years, and I, you know, like loved Zeppelin and Purple, like everyone, right? That comes through the 70s, especially if you're a guitar player. And I loved Eddie Van Halen. But I was really intrigued with sounds like, I loved Frankie Goes to Hollywood, I loved Thomas Dolby. There was that whole thing, you know, Duran Duran I thought were amazing, because it was so fresh, you know, compared to the 70s rock. So I was really interested in that. And I was really keen to work with the synth players. So when I saw Paul's ad, I immediately rang him. We talked on the phone for, you know, about an hour. We headed off, you know, so musically we were kind of on the same page. The very fortuitous thing was we both had a Tascam 244 Porta Studio. So he started mailing me cassettes with his synth drums and vocals on them. I would add in the guitar parts and send them back to him. This went back and forth, and I don't think we ever discussed like a direction, but our mutual thing was sort of so aligned that we didn't really need to. Paul and I never really discussed stuff. There was almost an unspoken communication there with what we were doing. So, you know, then we ended up with a tape with 4 songs on it that had Stimulation, Sugar Free, and I Could Make You Love Me were on that tape. So it was a pretty strong tape. You know, so we got that, a guy took that to the record company and we got a deal. So it all happened very quickly.
So it was organic. It was
very organic, yeah. It was. I mean, I think people have an idea that Wa Wa Nee was a very contrived band. It wasn't. We just made a record that we liked. We made a record that we wanted to hear ourselves, you know what I mean? And I think that's why I think, like our second album, for instance, was contrived because we'd had success, so we were then working by committee, if you like.
Yeah.
It's never as good.
No.
It's never as good. When you do things because that's what you want to do, that's how you get results.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
When Stimulation exploded on the charts in 1986, hitting number 2 and staying there for weeks, did life change overnight for you and the band?
Well, a good example, the first time we went on Countdown, and Countdown was pre-taped on the Saturday, right? Yeah. So flew down to Melbourne, did Countdown. Paul and I actually hosted it, right? So it was, you know, we suddenly had a big visibility right now. I'm back in Sydney, and my girlfriend at the time, she lived at Rose Bay, which is fairly near the Cross. So quite often on Sunday evening, we'd go get a meal up in the Cross. And she said to me, hey, let's go to the Cross and let's go get dinner, you know. So I jokingly said, I better be careful, I might get mobbed. Right now, I literally got out of the car and a bunch of teenage girls who just happened to be walking past. This is kind of weird, right? But they spotted me and they came up and jumped on me, and I was like, what the hell? I was not ready for this. I had all like lipstick marks all over my face and my girlfriend was in hysterics. This is, you know, that's how it changed. One viewing on Countdown, and that's what happened. So instantly, we were perceived as like pop stars or something, even though we were just these 2 young kids. You know, and the band went from doing, you know, we were doing shows already. In that period of us getting the record out and that becoming a hit, which was only probably a few weeks later, we'd done a couple of gigs in the Cross, but we'd have maybe, you know, 200-300 people coming. It built quite quickly. To suddenly we were doing beer barns to thousands of people and they were turning away. You know, so it got crazy, but that's the power of the hit single, particularly back then.
Yeah, totally.
And I think Countdown, because it was such a focus of what everyone, it was part of Australian culture, yeah? So one time on that and everything changed.
Yeah. How did you transition from being just a process studio band to actually forming a band?
Yeah, so what happened is, before the single came out, at this stage, Paul didn't want to do gigs. He just wanted to be a studio act. And I was like, man, that's kind of boring. You know, like you got to do gigs. This is the lifeblood of being a player, right? So, because I'd already been in bands for many years and doing gigs, and I loved it, right? So he sort of begrudgingly agreed to do it. So we got this guy, Geoff on bass, who'd been in a band called Solid Citizens. So we had the three of us, and then we couldn't find a drummer because there was no funky drummers. Everyone was from the AC/DC Cold Chisel school of rock, right? So he did a session, Geoff did a session with Chris Sweeney, who was out here touring with, I think it might have been the Village People or someone like that. And he said to us, you know, I think I've got the guy. I think I've got your drummer, right? So we had a rehearsal set up, and then Sween, our drummer, rocked up. The first thing I noticed about him is he had this massive PA speaker. Like, and I said to him, he reminded me of this recently. First thing I said to him was, hey man, you got a bigger speaker than I have. What's going on here? You know, because he had this massive, he had a Roland and a Tama endorsement.
Yeah, right.
And he had this Roland electronic kit. So it was like, you know, and literally we started playing within like a couple of bars. Paul and I just looked at each other like, this is the guy, right? So we got Chris, and we took it from there. You know, Geoff, the bass player, quit after, when Stimulation got to number 2, Geoff said, you know, Paul rings me and says, hey man, Geoff's quitting the band. And we were going on the interstate the next day. So he's like, what are we going to do? And I said, we'll go around and see him. So when we went around to Geoff's house, he's kind of quite an eccentric character. He's writing to Frank Zappa and all this, you know, excellent stuff, but not exactly vanilla. And I said to Geoff, hey man, why are you quitting the band? And his answer was, too many pastel colours, man. And Paul and I looked at each other like, what the hell does that even mean? Right? And I get it now. It means it's too vanilla flavoured for him, right?
What do you remember most about breaking into the US with Sugar Free, playing on American Bandstand and Top of the Pops? US must have been a surreal for an Aussie act at the time. Yeah,
look, what happened was we had this Australian management company, Sweet Conspiracy, very appropriately named, I might add, who had been mishandling the band for quite a long time, and we'd been doing countless gigs. And it was like, why are we doing these? Why are we playing in West Wyalong? No, all respect to West Wyalongites, but this isn't going to further the band. So we eventually gave them the flick. And then Chris Gilby, who's our publisher, he said, look, there were numerous people came out to meet us. I think one of them was the guy that managed Fleetwood Mac. I can't remember his name, but there was, you know, we had meetings with people, and then we were on Hamilton Island doing a gig, and this guy, Simon Napier Bell, flew out to Australia to meet us. Now, Simon, you know, is quite a well-known, music manager. He did, you know, the Yardbirds, Mark Bolan, Wham, Japan, and lots of other, you know, incredible bands. And he took us on, and within, you know, a couple of months of us signing with Simon, we did a world tour because he had the contacts, you know, and his whole kind of shtick was, what are you doing in Australia? He was absolutely right. With all respect, what are you doing here? You've already had big hits here. Yeah. You're just going to go round in circles. And also, it's not really the music of Australia. Yeah. You know, what we were doing was more American driven, right? Yeah. So, you know, he got us over there. Suddenly we're in the States. I remember we got picked up by a limo at Los Angeles airport. It's kind of surreal. And Sugar Free came on the radio while we were driving to the hotel, and we were like, "That's a kind of a good sign, I think." You know? So, you know, suddenly we were in America for quite a long time, for a few months, and we did numerous shows and lots of TV. We did Solid Gold, and you know, we did the Arsenio Hall Tonight Show. We played live on that. That was quite, you know, initially kind of terrifying, but once we started playing, it was just like any other gig. Yeah. Losing Phil Witchett during the second album sessions was a huge blow. How did the band find the strength to finish Blush, and how do you personally remember Phil today? Phil was incredible. He was such a beautiful guy. He was an amazing synthesizer and piano player. We were really gifted that we had Paul and Phil, both amazing keyboard players, in the band at the same time. So what had happened was there was 2 cars in Wa Wa Nee, the cool car and the uncool car. The uncool car had Paul, Mark, and Chris Sweeney, the drummer, in it, and the cool car had Debbie Day, who was our tour manager, myself, Phil, and Elliot, who was our merch guy. Right now, we used to smoke drugs and listen to Led Zeppelin, whereas the other car, they were all really studious and taking notes and stuff, right? So our car was cool. Anyway, we'd been traveling for about a year or two around Australia, right?
Yeah.
So Phil was often holding his mouth, right? He had a toothache. I said, man, you got to get that sorted too. When we were in London, Simon Napier Bell said, Phil, you got to get your teeth fixed, man. You can't be in like a pop group and had bad teeth, right? Because he had some rotten teeth and stuff. So Simon said, look, I've got a friend who's a dentist, so I'll send you to him and I'll cover the costs, right? So Phil went off to get his teeth fixed. Now, Phil came back, the guy didn't do anything, and he had a letter. And I remember the letter said, this is not a dental problem. That's all it said. And he had a referral to Sydney Oncology in the hospital. He flew back to Australia. He was dead about 3 months later.
That's incredible. How old was he?
He was young. He was a little bit older than me, so probably 29, something like that.
At the time he passed, he was 29.
Yeah, really young. You know, it was honestly, up until that single moment, I reckon that was the moment that took the wind out of our sails, and it's suddenly now we were sort of going through the motions a little bit. Like we'd lost that initial, interesting story. I was doing a gig the day that, the week that Phil died, his wife had a baby, right? Maybe about a week before he died, his wife had a baby, and the baby was called Phil. Now this was the night before Paul Gray died. Yeah, I was doing a gig in Adelaide. And I'm at the gig, prior to the gig, now this guy rocks up and he looks, I look at him like, man, I know this face from somewhere. It was Phil Witchett Jr.
Wow.
He'd come to the gig to meet me. And I was quite I'd held him at 3 days old, and it was the last time I'd seen him. I was quite moved by that. So it was kind of weird. And then that night, about 3 o'clock in the morning, I get a call from a friend of Paul and I's that Paul had died. So it was one of those like, what the hell?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I was going to say to you a bit before about bass players who sing. All my favourite artists are bass players who can sing.
Yeah.
Because they've got, like John Waite is a bass player who can sing.
McCartney, Sting.
Yeah, a heap of them.
There's an argument with I think that bass players, because of their role, they're naturally producers because they're hearing everything. Yeah. They're not doing the showy stuff. They're not out front. They're sitting back and they're watching and hearing. I mean, Ralphie, the guy I'm using now, Ralph Marshall, what a gun. Yeah. He's got a beautiful voice too.
He has, and he can go right up high as well.
He's amazing. He plays, like I said to him at one of the gigs in Sydney, I actually said, you need to stop being so good because you're making me, like it's the Steve Williams show here, and you're making me look very average. But he's a lovely cat. He's really humble, super down on his playing. He's always like, oh man, and I was like, you might have noticed that, but no one else did.
No one else did, that's right. You've got to hate those people, don't you?
He's incredible.
Well, it's been great talking to you,
Thank you,
Steve.
Pete. You too, man.
I appreciate it.
Absolutely.
It's been fantastic.
Thank you.
And I hope to see you again sometime
Absolutely.
at the club.
Thank you.
Great to have you. And thanks very much.
Thank you.
When voodoo strikes, it'll tear apart your head when voodoo